This week on the GabFest, will the Iran war damage the world economy, the American economy, and or the Republican Party? Oil prices have gyrated over the past week, spiking to $120 a barrel.
Yeah, well, the Secretary of Energy said it would be a blip, so this is more than a blip.
The war aims remain opaque to people.
Well, I don't think they have one clear aim. If you're the Iranians and you're thinking about how you win, it's all about outlasting the United States. And so the fact that it just seems so unclear and scattershot would give me hope that if I just persist, Trump is going to lose interest.
Hello and welcome to the Slate Political GabFest. March 12th, 2026. The Will Gas Hit $5 a Gallon edition. I'm David Plotz of CityCast. I'm in Washington, D.C., a windy Washington, D.C., from the New York Times Magazine and Yale University Law School in New Haven, Connecticut. Maybe, I don't know.
Nope.
Possibly in New Haven. Not in New Haven. Emily Bazelon.
Hey guys, I am not in New Haven. I'm outside San Juan in Puerto Rico, where it is so nice, and I can't wait to go outside later.
Oh man,
I feel like you're a lot of times in places that aren't New Haven,
That's good.
and that aren't like a Holiday Inn in Dubuque.
that from New York City is John Dickerson. John Dickerson has a new line of products for curly-haired men. Called the Wig Party. Love the slogan. If you don't change now, you're going to look like a Republican. John, I was with a prominent CEO this week, and that CEO told me the major way they get their news is by reading your Substack and a couple of other Substacks. God help us.
Wow. Well, that's God love them. I'm obviously whatever company they run is going to be successful in all that they do. That's great. Well, I mean, this week is a perfect example. I'm sure all of you read the multi-page analysis of the 7 different reasons that we're at war with Iran. But it was the reason that was created was I was like, how many reasons have they given? And are they really contradictory? And it was just super useful to do that. So I don't know if anybody else benefits from it, but I do. So I'm glad your CEO friend did.
This week on the GabFest, will the Iran war damage the world economy, the American economy, and or the Republican Party? Then the sacking of Kristi Noem and the increasingly disturbing plans for an American immigration gulag. And then could Trump declare an election emergency? What would that mean? What are some of the threats, ongoing threats to the midterms? Plus, we'll have cocktail chatter. Oil prices have gyrated over the past week, spiking to $120 a barrel briefly on Sunday, then receding to $80 a barrel or so, then spiking back to over $100 on Thursday after attacks on 2 tankers in the Gulf. The price swings are driven by the uncertainty about how disruptive the Iran war will be to oil markets in the long and medium term. Iran has threatened ship traffic in the Strait of Hormuz, which carries 20% of world oil, and countries around the world have now pledged to tap 400 million barrels of reserves. But in the medium term, in the long term, people can increase production in other places. In the medium term, there isn't probably enough capacity to cover the world's demand for oil and natural gas if the straits continue to be effectively closed. And gas prices are climbing in the U.S. I think I saw they were up 17% in a week. So, John, did the administration not expect this outcome when they attacked Iran? Why was this not foreseen?
Yeah, well, the Secretary of Energy said it would be a blip. So this is more than a blip. And it seems like, and we'll see, we'll see how long the situation in the Strait of Hormuz is a problem. But for right now, it's a problem. And it's allowing, it attaches to the larger question of the entire war, which is, will the Iranians be successful in creating economic and political pain for the United States, which they are not able to do through military pain? So the U.S. can dominate in conventional military action and has done it in, world-class fashion, with the obvious notable exception of the 175 killed in the mistaken bombing of the girls' elementary school, which we should talk about, because with all the flexing and chest beating from the Secretary of Defense, that obviously was a major screw up. But the U.S. is dominating in that sphere, but Iran has a higher pain threshold when it comes to politics. So the protests in the street have not emerged that the president relied on when he suggested this was a war for regime change. And Iran is able to keep its populace, or has been successful in keeping its populace subdued. In the States, political blowback for Republicans could cause pressure on the administration that war, that the actual fighting wouldn't create, and that's all through the Strait of Hormuz and oil prices.
Emily, one of the things that I think is problematic, and John, you were actually getting at this before we started taping, when you were talking about while we were taping, we were talking about your Substack post, that the war aims remain opaque to people, which it makes it hard to make a case that we should patriotically endure these oil prices or even understand why these oil prices are higher, or be like, well, yeah, this is just the price of protecting democracy. This is just the price of freedom. This is the price of whatever, which is something you can do. People are willing to sort of take a hit. They're willing to tighten the belt when they feel they understand what the cause is, and the cause is just. But this is a remarkably unpopular venture, in part because they've done such an extremely poor job explaining it.
Well, I don't think they have one clear aim, right? I mean, President Trump has talked about all kinds of things. He has zigzagged from supporting the protesters to, unconditional surrender, to choosing the next leader of Iran. They rarely talk about the nuclear materials, which would seem to be actually the thing that could be a priority that would make sense. When Secretary of State Marco Rubio talks about this, they're more limited aims. They're like military aims about taking out bases and naval ships and making it impossible for Iran to use those kinds of military equipment against the U.S. or the region. But it's all over the place. And I mean, I don't think we have any idea, really. It does seem like maybe Trump was just like switching the channel. And if you're the Iranians and you're thinking about how you win, it's all about outlasting the United States. And so the fact that it just seems so unclear and scattershot would give me hope that if I just persist, Trump is going to lose interest.
Yeah, one of the clearest ways to measure, I mean, when you think back on the Iraq War, the only way you can measure accountability is whether what they say were the reasons for going for war remain consistent. Because if it's not consistent, then you think, well, if they're making it up as they go along, maybe they made it up when they started. And so just to run through the 7 reasons, they claimed there was an imminent threat. So that was that Iran was about to attack. Then Marco Rubio said, well, no, we were preempting a retaliatory threat because Israel was going to attack, and then we knew they were going to attack us. So since we knew that eventuality might happen, we had to attack. Then there's the elimination of the future conventional threat, which Marco Rubio also said they were stockpiling these missiles, and in a year or so that would make them invulnerable, and so we had to attack now. Then Hegseth said, no, they had a gun to our head. We had to attack right now. Then there's the nuclear argument, Emily, which you said has been variable. You've had, on the one hand, this argument that in negotiations, Iran was so recalcitrant that the president decided, you know what? They're not bargaining with us, and that means they really want to have a nuke, and we can't let them have a nuke, so we got to go. We got to attack. And then you have that Iran was destabilizing the region. That's another reason that's been used. And then finally, regime change, which you mentioned this, Emily. It is extraordinary that the president of the United States, who said George W. Bush should be impeached for Iraq, nevertheless, in interviews has said, I want to be involved in picking the next leader. And the one that they've now picked, the son of the previous supreme leader, the president said, no, I wouldn't be happy with him. So you now have Donald Trump saying that he wants to be involved in the future selection of the Iranian government. That's a long and weird place to be.
Emily, what do you feel about the terrible situation we find ourselves in, or the unusual situation we find ourselves in? No declared congressional support for any military action that's taking place in the world right now. And the United States recently sort of invaded Venezuela and captured the leader of Venezuela. Is it in an ongoing air war against ships in the Caribbean that are identified with smuggling drugs for all, but without any kind of support for that? An embargo on Cuba that is, must surely, like, it is some kind of, I don't know if that violates the laws of international relations, but is really, really a brutal thing that's going on in Cuba. And now an active war in Iran. And none of this publicly supported, none of this debated in Congress, and none of this having received any actual legislative stamp.
Yeah, so I think it's way too easy for presidents to use force abroad without going to Congress for approval. It's not like it's never done. I mean, both of the presidents Bush did get congressional approval for the Gulf War and the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. But we also have presidents, including Clinton and Obama, kind of going beyond the 60-day timeline in the War Powers Resolution and not getting approval. So that idea that Congress declares war, which is absolutely what the Constitution says, has eroded. And it's sort of just like that the president can do it. And then he has this whole Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department to kind of justify the legality of the actions. And Congress doesn't issue its own legal opinions. So, and then the courts kind of stay out of it. Yeah, I mean, the other thing that's obviously happened this time is that Congress decided not to stop the president, right? There was legislation proposed that would say that these military hostilities have to stop unless and until Trump got authorization from Congress, and that got voted down. And so Congress is sort of emasculating itself in all of this and acting like a bystander.
And even if there's not a vote to go to war, the norm that used to exist, that you at least had to make a strong claim for why this was an emergency action, that even seems to have slipped. I mean, they obviously nodded to it in some of the rationales that said, well, this was an imminent threat. But like putting through an articulated rationale that the members of Congress could then use to explain why this was going on didn't really even take place. And so you have members of Congress giving rationales for the war that the administration at the same time is saying are not the rationale for war. For example, the nuclear piece. In briefings, the Pentagon is telling members of Congress, no, we're not trying to get rid of their nuclear program. And yet on the air, you have allies of the White House saying, oh, no, this was about their nuclear program.
I mean, it is a genuine problem that you have a administration, I mean, that's free jazzing it, that's like improving it, but also that has reached a point where they also can't be trusted in what they say. And that there was this really amazing specific example this week where the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, tweeted that a U.S. ship had escorted a tanker through the Strait of Hormuz, and oil prices dropped on this news. And then the tweet was very quickly deleted, turned out not to have been true. And so, of course, you expect there to be uncertainty in the information ecosystem at a time like this, and you expect there to be half-truths and falsehoods all the time. You shouldn't expect that would come from literally the Energy Secretary of the United States. I mean, I guess at this point we're so used to it coming from the President of the United States, but you would think the Energy Secretary of the United States has a very strong interest in not disrupting oil markets, and yet here he goes and does it. And so, in addition to the problem that they haven't articulated the aims well, is the problem that they almost are incapable of articulating the aims well because what they say is no longer to be relied on in any sense. So even if they told us something, a huge percentage of people would simply be like, I don't know, you told me other things the other day, and which are false. And so it is a perplexing situation for the United States that even if there were very strong evidence that Iran were about to engage in imminent attack on the United States, not clear that this president could persuade the American people that were actually true.
And also he has said, and he's now said in subsequent remarks, that he just had a feeling Iran was going to attack. And so what you have is he's basically saying, like, well, whatever the intelligence was, this was what my gut feeling was. And that's, now it's just hooked up entirely to the emotional views of the president, which is not the way it's supposed to work.
It feels deeply unserious in some way, right? Like they're not even bothering to go through the motions of serious governing.
Right, and they get so much pleasure, the pleasure that Hegseth gets out of this macho pose and this kind of bellicosity, and the pleasure they obviously get in like we're killing and destroying, is so gross. I mean, if it is fine, like I understand why wars take place and why people are killed in wars, but usually the people who do it are doing it because they have a goal in mind that is specific. It is not the pleasure of we got to use those really cool bombs.
Yeah, that was a horrible moment about sinking and also like we sunk the ships instead of taking them captive, because like that just seemed like more. I mean, Trump made some statement about that also just was.
And when you think of America's great military leaders, those who've been successful and those who are the military heroes, you don't find a lot of quotes of them like strutting around saying how cool it is that they get to kill people and how how wonderful it is to blow up and especially again the 175 killed in the Iranian elementary school. The preliminary reporting is not just a missile kind of went awry; it's that the planning that they're boasting about was wrong. And attached to that, you had the president go through a series of. At first, he made up this idea that the Iranians might have done it, and held on to that made up story, even when his Secretary of Defense wasn't using it. And then finally, when it became too impossible, even for the president to bear, he said, "Oh, I don't know anything about it." So again, your phrase, David, the jazz being played is like it's all jazz. The whole thing was jazz, and now the United States is engaged in this war, and you can see that the president feels the political pressure because he says things like, "The Straits are in great shape." The Straits, Mr. and Mrs. America, are not in great shape, and he's just like reaching for things to try to downplay the severity of the war, calling it an excursion. Which is usually like when you decide maybe you're going to take a cruise, not when you unleash 5,000 bombs or 5,000 strikes, I guess. So there's a way in which, in real time, it refreshes the fundamental question of did they know what they were doing and did they have to do this?
Can I say one more thing about the strike on the girls' school, which is that in 2022, the Pentagon started this center that was all about precision strikes, having people who are specialists in targeting look through the data and do real-time mapping to prevent civilian harm. And it seems like that's exactly what went wrong here, because the New York Times has been doing these amazing visual investigations where they're showing that this girls' school is near a naval base of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. It was part of the base, but it was fenced off between 2013 and 2016. So this is more than 10 years ago that it became separate. And look, I don't know whether the decimation of this precision striking center at the Pentagon is directly responsible for the fact that they messed this up. But of course, Hegseth decimated it because it's about preventing civilian harm, which is not something he thinks the military should care about. And there just is something so brutal about that. I feel the same way about the cultural heritage sites all over Iran that we seem to have just like kind of willfully destroyed.
Can we end on where we started, which is just the effect on American pocketbooks? So I saw a statistic which suggested that if oil goes to $5 a gallon, that adds about $100 a month to the budget of someone who drives a truck in the United States. And that is $100 a month, $1,200 a year is a huge amount of money in additional, that's just additional gas cost. And if you remember that one of the real inflation welts that Biden took was about gas prices. I mean, gas prices are so direct for people. They feel it so directly. How long do you think, is Trump willing to endure the political pain that will come if gas prices go up? And gas prices is not one of these things where he can jawbone people into lowering those prices. Like, these are retailers who, have paid X amount. They cannot sell gas that they've paid, $3.50 for. They cannot sell it for $3 a gallon. They just can't do it. That's not a tenable situation.
I think it attaches to what we've talked about before, which is every time people say, hey, we're really, really concerned about affordability, and the president is incapable, even in a speech devoted to the topic of affordability, he's incapable of actually talking about it. And then now this is sort of in that same category. He's off with a war that people may or may not understand why it started. And again, there's real-time confusion about why it started or why it's going on. And so on the key thing they care about, with the key critique they have, which is that he hasn't kept the eye on the ball, he isn't keeping his eye on the ball. And it's making the thing they care about even worse. And the New York Times has a piece Thursday morning about healthcare costs, so you have inflation is at 2.4%. It was reported this week. That is remarkable given the president's tariff war. And by the way, before the war with Iran, there was the war with tariffs. I mean, the president has had one kind of exciting rewiring of the global economy after another. But healthcare prices are going up faster than the consumer price index. And so you have a situation where oil is kind of another, as you say, David, the gas prices are the daily reminder that the president's claim that everything's going great is not going great. And then you have Senator Roger Marshall telling Caitlin Collins on CNN, well, freedom is not free. So, you're going to just have to make some sacrifices with these gas costs. That is not going to be a sustainable political argument.
Right. And that goes exactly back to what we were talking about earlier, which is if you don't actually articulate why this is for freedom, no one will buy that. No one believes that. And I think that's where we stand. Emily, why did Kristi Noem lose her job as Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security? Did she actually lose? Has she actually lost it? I mean, he said she's out of the job. He said this other person is going to be nominated.
We're having a transition period of a couple of weeks. I think this is all. I mean, Noem's replacement, Mark Wayne Mullins, the senator from Oklahoma, has to get confirmed by the Senate. So there's that. But he's supposed to take over at the end of March. Kristi Noem lost her job because. Maybe she was even telling the truth about this, but she was being grilled by Congress about this $220 million contract that was for making ads. Noem's, this is when she took over as Secretary of Homeland Security. She had this idea, we're going to make these ads about why people should leave the country, self-deport. And she spent tons of money on it. The ads prominently feature her on horseback in front of Mount Rushmore. If you haven't seen a photo of this, I really recommend that you go look at it. So first of all, the whole thing.
Also a vacation opportunity for anyone.
Lots of money. But in addition, thanks to really good reporting from ProPublica, and I think this is from last fall, it emerged that a great part of this ad contract went to a firm that is owned by the husband, or run, I should say, by the husband of Tricia McLaughlin, who was Noem's chief spokeswoman until a week or two ago. So it just looks like a big fat contract. It was a no-bid contract also. Noem claims that neither she nor any political appointee had anything to do with it, knew about it. As she was talking about that in front of the Senate, she said, well, actually, this was the president's idea. And she was, I think, harking back to a happier time in the beginning of the administration where, and she had talked about this a while ago, where basically Trump was like, yeah, I want you to make these ads telling people to leave, and I want you to be in them. So she kind of made the whole thing seem like his idea. And that we finally found was just a bridge too far. There were many other reasons why Noem could have gotten fired. Her relationship with Corey Lewandowski, a Trump ally who is not officially at the Department of Homeland Security, but had this special employee status that let him basically be constantly by Noem's side. They may or may not be having an affair. She did not actually deny that in front of they're just, there's the luxury jet that DHS purchased. Yes, John, would you like to add more?
Yes. I mean, she was not fired when federal agents in Minneapolis shot and killed 2 American citizens. She wasn't fired when the chief judge in Minnesota said her immigration agency had violated more court orders than some federal agencies in their entire existence. She called a Veterans Affairs nurse, Alex Preddy, a domestic terrorist. She falsely claimed that he brandished a weapon. She also had a series of falsehoods about Renee Good, including in front of Jake Tapper, when Jake Tapper showed the video and Noem to the camera said, effectively said, don't believe your eyes. I'm telling you what happened, which of course did not happen. None of those things were disqualifying. And then finally, the thrust of the policies and the mindset that created all those conditions actually wasn't Noem. I mean, it was Stephen Miller and the president. And so to the extent that any of that has a root in the administration, she was the person who sort of was the face of it. But all the policies and all of that stuff will all still continue.
And to your point, John, she wasn't, in fact, she didn't lose her job for the policies. She lost her job because what she was doing was distracting from the policies. It was making the policies harder to carry out. So it wasn't that the policies were unsuccessful, it's that her too high profile embarrassments, just, ridiculousness was distracting people from the work of enforcing these policies in the way they wanted. That she she made it harder for them to carry out these draconian and cruel policies, and that's why they got rid of her. Now we'll have somebody who's less distracting who will be more able to carry out those policies.
That's so perfectly put. The National Review wrote, Noam's greatest interest seemed to be in wearing various DHS uniforms for the camera.
Can we go back to these violated court orders? Because I'm a little obsessed with this. Like, what is going on? I mean, a lot of court orders just being blown through. What's happening here is that last summer, the Trump administration adopted a brand new reading of the big 1996 immigration statute. And this reading said that basically almost everyone who has entered the country illegally at ICE's request is subject to mandatory detention without a bond hearing. Right? A bond hearing is where the judge sets the terms for release. ICE says, doesn't matter that we've been reading the statute in a different way for 30 years. Now, this is how we read it. And then the Board of Immigration Appeals, which sets precedent for immigration judges around the country, they agreed with the Trump administration. So that means that whenever ICE comes to court and says, this person, doesn't matter if they've been in the country for 20 years or 20 days, and they don't have to have any criminal history, we want this person mandatory detention, and you can't have a bond hearing to let them out. And then the immigration judges have to go along at this point. So the recourse that people who are detained have is to go to federal court and file a habeas petition. And there's this flood of habeas petitions going through the courts. They are totally crushing the U.S. attorney's offices that have to then handle them. And they're a huge load for the district courts. And the district court judges, which are not bound by this, frankly, like pretty implausible reading of this 1996 law, they're ordering immediate release. They're ordering bond hearings. They're ordering people to be brought back from Mexico who were wrongfully deported in the midst of all this chaos. And ICE is not keeping up with all these orders. Now, you know, you could say like, okay, well, this is a huge flood. But the thing is, the cause of the flood is also ICE, right? They're the ones making these surge of arrests that are leading to all of these detentions and habeas cases. So it's like, if you don't like this, then you can control the front end. Instead, of course, what ICE is doing is making all these people in detention pay the price for the fact that it is not keeping up with the court orders. And you know, maybe this is obvious at this point, but detention is horrible. Like, detention is worse than a lot of prisoner jails in terms of the conditions. And there are a lot of kids in these detention facilities, which really we should just be calling prisons.
Can I try and find a through line here, which is sowing chaos to preach order? So in this case, create chaos in the court system and then say, oh my God, look at how chaotic the immigration system is. I mean, you need us to have this maximalist hand in Iran. One of the arguments kind of dribbling out now is, well, look at what it's doing to the economy in the Straits of Hormuz. I mean, we've got to stop Iran from shutting down the Straits of Hormuz and their Houthi allies from messing around in the Red Sea, which we didn't even discuss. So we got to keep going because of all this chaos. But the chaos wouldn't exist if it hadn't been unleashed. And then our third topic, which will be about the elections, which is you do something that creates chaos in the electorate and then use that as a pretext for either military action or at least questioning the outcomes because there's chaos that you created.
Implicit in what you're saying, John, that is the number one authoritarian playbook move. That is what authoritarian governments do, is create a false sense of emergency, which they then can respond to with some sort of suppressive draconian measure. Can we linger on this question of detention for a second, Emily? So throughout this week, there have been stories about various DHS efforts to create facilities to house thousands, tens of thousands of people in immigrant detention. And the basic gist of almost all the stories is town in a kind of rural, remote area discovers that someone has bought a warehouse or is trying to buy a warehouse for $100 million. They either before the warehouse is bought or just after it, they realize it's DHS. And that DHS is planning to turn this warehouse facility into part of the American Gulag. They are planning to put thousands of people into these metal shed boxes and just make them immiserate them until they can get them out of the country. There's one being discussed that's just absolutely colossal, as big as 12 football fields, and this one in the New York Times when they wrote about this space as big as 12 football fields, only one entrance and exit. So you can imagine the case of fire. It's like what the F is that? I mean, like, come on. One fire exit, minimal recreation areas, no place for people to meet with lawyers, just a gigantic shed. Also, no separation between people. So if someone gets sick, like you're going to get sick, everyone is going to get sick. And these are not, we have to remember, and Emily, you were just touching on this, these are not people who have committed crimes, but beyond the crime, which I use in heavy quotes, of immigration presence in the United States, like of being present without proper authorization. They have not committed crimes against other people in the way that we think of crimes. Not that treating people appallingly is justified in the case of people who are criminals either, but these are just people who have run up against DHS in some way, and then we put them in these appalling conditions, and it's the scale of the imprisonment is just shocking. It's shocking, and it's embarrassing, and we should be ashamed. Like, people are ashamed. They don't want to live next to these places.
Well, that's actually been really interesting. So what's happening here is Congress gave DHS and specifically ICE just an enormous amount of money in the budget, and there is $45 billion for constructing and running new detention centers. So then ICE has gone around the country and identified at least 24 of these huge warehouses it wants to buy and convert. And you're right, it's kind of sneaking up on a lot of communities. All over the country, Texas, Florida, Missouri, New Hampshire, Virginia, people are protesting. They do not want these huge detention facilities in their communities. And I think part of it is because of the awareness of how terrible the conditions are. Also, there are like these basic problems like water. A huge warehouse is not meant to have water for tens of thousands of people. And these are rural areas that's not like easily. So, I mean, I was reading one story about ICE talking about trucking in enough water for all these people. It really is quite something. I'm not sure what to say. I don't know how many of them are actually going to get built, honestly, because of the local opposition. And because, frankly, like you were saying, David, you look at the plans. I was talking to someone about one of these detention facilities / prisons that exists already in East Montana called Fort Bliss. And he was saying, like, what's horrible about it is not that there's like mold on the walls or what we usually think of as like terrible prison. It's that there's no separation. There are no walls that go up to the ceiling. And so you have these units of like 70 people, but they're not truly separated. And so everything is incredibly loud all the time. You can hear other people. There's just no quiet. There's very little safe place to go have any kind of recreation. Anyway, these facilities are really, really alarming places, and there are kids in them.
When our descendants write the history of this time, they will shame us for it. They really will. I mean, these are not concentration camps. They're not internment camps. Oh, I guess maybe they are internment camps. But like, what is being done is just, it's villainous. And people, like, I do think there is a visceral reaction. Like, it is one thing to think people live in prison towns all the time, but people in prisons are people who have, been through a judicial process. They have committed crimes. And so people understand, like, well, we have to have a carceral system for people who have committed crimes. And I understand, and, my community is benefiting from this. This is totally different. This is some sense that there's a category of people who are kind of just like us, who, have done something. They've done nothing but lived here, kind of made a mistake, willingly overstayed a visa, and they're sitting in squalor and terror and fear right around the corner from us, and nobody, imagine that. Imagine thinking that, John, like down the street from you in Manhattan, this was going on, or Emily, like, down over by East Rock somewhere in New Haven, there's 10,000 people. It would spook you and creep you out, and no wonder people are objecting.
As you say that, David, I remember Newt Gingrich in, I guess, the 2012 presidential primaries on the Republican side. And Mitt Romney kind of flirted for about 10 seconds with the idea of self-deportation. I mean, he used the phrase, and it was the beginnings of this. And Gingrich treated the idea as laughable and cruel and inhuman that American forces of whatever kind would round up, grandmothers, or round up families that had been here, or round up people who weren't obvious criminals. That was kind of laughable. It was both unworkable and also was inhumane. And when you think about there's this debate within Republican circles about how much one should be constrained by the Gospels that so many of them talk about, because when it comes to the stranger or to the least of us or those who don't have means, what you've just described, David, is a situation in which you are creating, it's not just what you believe about how you should treat those people, but whether you should create a class of them. Because if you put them in these conditions, you are taking somebody who was living a life that had, food on the table and family connections and the human basic needs, and you are creating a worse life. And to kind of be okay with that and cheer it is it's a real distance to have traveled in since 2012. Let's put it that way.
I also just want to bring this back to Congress because it all makes the case for comprehensive immigration reform, right? Like having some way of having a path to citizenship, having worker visas, having a secure border, sure, but then also having a way that people who come to the country for economic opportunity can be here legally. And then we, can decide that other people don't get to come. Okay. But so much of what's happening is that people come here to make a life. And then all of a sudden right now they are having the rug ripped out from under them in a way that has not really happened before.
The Trump effort to shape and control and possibly disrupt the 2026 midterm elections continues on three fronts this week. Federal officials, DHS and the FBI, is it DHS? Maybe it is. Yeah, it is DHS and the FBI are investigating.
Yes.
Those guys are everywhere, are investigating the 2020 election in Arizona, specifically in Maricopa County, a very Democratic county in Arizona, and teaming up with election deniers in the state to seize voting records and, make the case that Maricopa County vote elections are corrupted and therefore not to be trusted. Second, Trump allies are making ever louder noises about declaring a national emergency before the election in order to we'll discuss what that might be. Emily will explain what that might be if there were a national emergency and how that might play out. And then finally, Republicans are at odds about what to do about the SAVE Act, a House measure that passed the House that would require proof of citizenship for voting and impose other voting restrictions that Republicans generally like and Democrats generally don't, and how far the Senate should push Democrats in the senatorial sort of procedural process to try to highlight that bill. Excuse me. So, Emily, maybe let's start with the emergency question. So, what would it mean for President Trump to declare an emergency around voting? What might he be able to do if he did that? And what are the mechanisms to restrain him if he does?
I mean, in the fever dreams of the people in the administration who believe in the conspiracy theories about the 2020 election, the president would have a federal takeover of the elections in 2026 or 2028. They would somehow march in and take control of all of the voting machines and balloting process. All of this are run by states and counties. And then they would declare the outcomes and, they would do it all in the name of like, there's so much election fraud and we can't trust all these states and counties. And, then presumably it would be much easier to find those missing votes that Trump probably still thinks cost him Georgia, right? From his famous phone call with the Secretary of State of Georgia saying that he was just looking for 12,000 votes. I mean, that is the kind of nightmare scenario because it would be a breach of free and fair elections in the United States. Some of these, super hyped up fraud folks had a conference recently, and there were people from high up in the government who attended the conference from the White House, from the Justice Department. Then they said like, oh, never mind, we're just here kind of hanging out. But it's not a good sign that this is being taken seriously.
I mean, past performance is a guarantee of future results. President Trump has done this since 2016, and even before, when he wasn't a candidate, claimed that there were irregularities when there were no irregularities, to sow chaos for the purposes of trying to claim order, which includes a different outcome.
So what are the blocking mechanisms for this? Is it, courts, I presume, could, try to stay this order, but the president has shown again and again his ability to sort of like the action, like if you take the action, you set the facts on the ground. It's kind of hard for courts to unroll that.
Yeah, I mean, there would be immediate lawsuits, obviously. There would have to be some warning for this if it happened before Election Day. But you're right. I mean, the fast-paced nature of it could make it hard for courts to respond to. I mean, it is clearly unconstitutional. It's also true that Trump has obeyed Supreme Court orders thus far, right? I mean, he did roll back the tariffs when he was ordered to do so. So I don't want to go like into total doomsday scenario here. What's really important is for none of this to happen. Not one single tiny step to be taken in this direction. And what I do not like about, this whole investigation in Maricopa County in Arizona, like the one in Fulton County in Georgia, I mean, it's all based on these totally debunked conspiracy theories. So I don't like anything about it. But the notion that it's like a practice run and they're kind of testing out different methods and different legal tools they could have, that's a part that is really, really disturbing.
It's reminiscent of what Rudy Giuliani told Rusty Bowers, the Republican Speaker of the Arizona House, when he was trying to overthrow the election in 2020, when he said, we've got lots of theories, we just don't have the evidence. They are still on the hunt for evidence that they don't have for the theories they have in abundance.
I do think, going back to your point about the Supreme Court, I you can be cynical about the Supreme Court as much as you want. I do not see the Supreme Court being a strong endorser of a national emergency around elections. It doesn't seem to me like that's something that this court is going to be like, oh yeah, that seems fine. That seems like a regular presidential power.
Yeah, agree. Can we go back to the SAVE Act? Because so let's just talk about this. The SAVE Act is, as written, says that everybody has to provide proof of citizenship in person to register to vote. So that would mean that you'd have to show up with your birth certificate or your passport, basically. Like many people have neither of those things in their possession. It's really different from like regular old voter ID where you show your driver's license or something equivalent.
And as we're talking about the difficulties with implementing the SAVE Act, there are 6,000 different kinds of birth certificates in the United States, which means that the poor county bursar, assessor, election person is going to have to determine whether this is a valid birth certificate.
Are they going to make all of us who already are registered have to go back and do it? Does the SAVE Act require us to go back, or is it just that future people, when registering? And does a real ID qualify?
No, a real ID does not qualify.
Unless it has a citizenship. Some real IDs apparently have a citizenship thing, but just because you have a real ID doesn't necessarily mean it's checked your citizenship.
Anyway, that is a real barrier to voting. Voter ID turns out to not affect that many people, not as many as the opponents of it thought, but this is a whole next level.
Also, there's no federal money for this. So all the states would have to figure this stuff out on their own at a forced march. I mean, I think it's going to die in the Senate. But anyway, yes, unworkable.
I do find it weird because I think almost all voting restrictions at this point actually help Democrats. That Democrats are higher propensity voters, and higher propensity voters are likely to go through the hoops of dealing with it. And so I understand why, as a moral matter, Democrats do not want these voting restrictions. But if any of these laws actually get passed, it's not at all clear to me that it hurts them.
Yeah, that's possible at this point. I mean, it's interesting because the Republicans have really drunk the Kool-Aid on voter fraud. But you're right, David, that things have sort of shifted in terms of who is higher propensity and more sort of intent and who is lower propensity. But, also the people who are lower propensity are also sometimes more likely to change sides in terms of which party they vote for. So I feel like it's not totally clear.
Yeah, I was thinking about drinking the Kool-Aid. Like, you could imagine, and there's some evidence for this, that they actually don't think there is voter fraud because, as has been proved again and again and again, in-person non-citizen voter fraud is almost vanishingly small, which is to be distinct from registration by non-citizens, which is still really small, but is a slightly large, like barely slightly larger class. And then there's also been these various evidence cases in various states where you had efforts to root out. The Kansas story is the one I'm thinking about with Kobach, the Secretary of State, Chris Kobach, who tried to root out non-citizen voting. And then it turned out that an overwhelming number of the people that were supposedly non-citizens who voted were indeed citizens. But I wonder, Emily, if the Kool-Aid they've drunk or if what they've embraced is, yeah, it may not really happen, but boy, is this a useful disruptive technique. It puts the other side, it puts Democrats on their heels. It's a talking point for us with our supporters. And boy, our president sure loves it. So even if the facts of the case don't exist, it's just irresistible as a political thing to embrace.
Yeah, or they think it's irresistible. I mean, there was this nutty quote from Trump the other day where he was like, everywhere I go, people are talking about the Save America Act. This is what they want. This is how we're going to win the midterms. I was just like, what? Like, that cannot be true. You just don't want to talk about gas prices.
Well, I mean, let's talk about this politically, John. So the particular conflict is how much Senate Majority Leader John Thune is willing to do to get the SAVE Act through the Senate. And is he willing to force opponents of the SAVE Act, the Democrats, to filibuster in some fashion? And in particular, there's this desire among some in the Republican Party to force the Democrats to do a real old-timey talking filibuster, which would tie the Senate up. And it would make the Senate not be able to do anything. It would also allow Democrats to force all kinds of votes on amendments. And it would, so the politics was it would tie the Senate up. Senate wouldn't do anything else. Not that they're doing that much, and it would put the Democrats on record opposing this. But it also means that the country might talk less about immigration or affordability, or maybe it wouldn't. Maybe the country would keep talking about it and be like, why is the Senate doing nothing? So where do you think the politics shake out on this?
Yeah, it's a great question. One other thing I would add is that it's having some real-time effect on the Texas Senate race, where you have John Cornyn in a runoff against Ken Paxton, the state attorney general, and Cornyn has changed his lifelong opposition to changing the filibuster, arguing that the filibuster should be changed in order to pass the SAVE Act, which has passed the House and is not going to be able to make the cloture threshold of 60 votes to stop debate so that it could pass in the Senate unless you change the rules and pierce the filibuster, which Cornyn now says he supports, as he wrote in a piece in the New York Post, because Democrats wanted to do it. And if they get it back in power, they'll get rid of the filibuster. So we can't disarm. So it's preemptive retaliation, which sounds possibly like what we might have heard with respect to one of the justifications for the Iran war. Anyway, it looks like what Thune's going to do is not even have a talking filibuster because he doesn't want to tie up the Senate for a super long time. So he has promised a series of votes that will put all the Democrats on record because, as you said, David, this is, instead of trying to talk about affordability in a way that changes people's minds, which even if Trump could do it effectively, and he's almost figured out how to be singularly ineffective, even if he could do it effectively, it's really hard to change people's minds about the economy. So this is the easier route, just freak them out. But will that really work? Can they go on and on? I think you'll see if Democrats, because again, talking about the SAVE Act is not talking about what people care about. So if you have to keep convincing people that they should really care about the SAVE Act, you're not doing anything about the thing that, as you pointed out earlier, David, they're recognizing every day at the checkout counter or at the gas pump. So as a political matter, I don't think this sustains for a very long time. They'll try and make it something that hurts Democrats. But if you were a functioning opposition party, you could use a discussion about election interference to talk about January 6th. They just hung the plaque at the dark of night supporting the policemen. I mean, if you had the level of skill of, say, a Bill Clinton or somebody like that, you could turn this into a moment for your side. But there doesn't seem to be anybody on the Democratic side who can do that.
Let us go to cocktail chatter when it's dark of night, when you're having a cocktail in dark of night, which these days it has to be really late now that we have daylight saving. Or do we not have daylight saving? No, we're in daylight saving. What are you going to be having in a dark of night cocktail? Or you're going to have a dark and stormy, Emily, because you're in Puerto Rico.
Where they don't do daylight savings, I discovered. What am I gonna chatter about? So okay, to back up. As some people in the Justice Department have done some kind of questionable things, there have been bar complaints filed against them in their state bar associations. I'm speaking of Pam Bondi herself and Lindsay Halligan, the erstwhile never really was head of the Eastern District of Virginia U.S. Attorney's Office. For the most part, the bar associations have been kind of like anemic in responding to these. However, there was a report that the Florida bar was actually moving ahead on Halligan. Then the Florida bar pulled that back. But in the middle of all this, Bondi said that she wants the Justice Department to basically be taking control over these potential bar disciplinary investigations from the State Bar Association. The Justice Department put something in the Federal Register saying that if there was something to investigate, they wanted to go first. This is not something the state bar associations need to abide by, and they should not. But it's, another sign of kind of like encroaching, usurping of power and basically like a scare tactic. And also in the middle of all this, it turns out that Bondi is calling for the disbarment for Roger Alford, who was one of the deputies in the antitrust division and called out this sweetheart settlement that allowed a merger to go forward last summer. Alford said basically this was because of backroom dealing. He was pushed out of his job, but, he spoke up criticizing it. And so that seems to be what Bondi wants him disbarred for. So anyway, as usual, down is up and up is down. The people who really do seem to be causing trouble, Bondi wants off the hook. She wants to disbar someone else. There is one sort of actual ray of sunlight here, which is that the DC bar is trying to discipline, or at least has brought proceedings against Ed Martin, who was how to describe? He's like the guy who started this whole idea of this weaponization working group. He's one of the Trump henchmen who is the most eager to use criminal prosecution as a weapon against Trump's perceived enemies. He was also, like the acting U.S. attorney in D.C. for a while till he got
like 10
pushed
minutes
out. Yeah, but it was 10 painful minutes. Anyway, so it is optimistic that the D.C. bar seems to be doing something about that, but this kind of counter move by Bondi is also happening.
J.D., what is your chatter?
My chatter is, first of all, does anybody know what dendrochronology is?
The study of tree roots, tree rings.
Yes, I knew you were going to get this, David. I'm so happy because I when I read dendrochronology, I was like, you know what? David's going to know what that word means. Let's say, had to be reminded of it because maybe 58 or 9 years ago, I might have known what the definition was, but since I'm only 57, I couldn't remember. Anyway, a study in a journal devoted to dendrochronology in January determined that they know exactly where the wood in the Stradivarius violins came from. And there are a bunch of theories about why the Stradivarius is amazing. Is it the shape? Is it the chemicals that were used in the varnish? But also, were the spruces that grew in a period of basically where the Winter Olympics were held? Is that what did it? So how did they do this? Well, first, how did they figure out exactly where they were from? There were about 800 of these instruments. There was a dude who measured the tree rings on John Topham, 284 Stradivarius violins. So he measured the distance between the tree rings, which you can see in the violins. They then took those measurements and they matched them against the collected records of 6,000 tree rings across the world in the tree ring data bank. And apparently the tree rings change depending on the elevation, the weather, and so forth. And so they were able to figure out that by matching these two things, that the wood for the Stradivarius came from this Penneveggio forest in Italy, I think it might be called. Anyway, so it was just a fantastic sleuthing process that determine where they're from.
All right. So much Vaseline content before my actual chatter. So we got really great Vaseline replies in response to my chatter about how Vaseline is inexhaustible. The world may be running out of oil, but it will never run out of that petroleum-based product, Vaseline. So, and I wanted to highlight two amazing emails. So one from Carol, who she was going to Australia as an exchange student. She asked her mom to get her the biggest container of Vaseline they had at Kmart, and she had meant the skin lotion, the Vaseline Intensive Care, but her mom instead came back with the Vaseline Petroleum Jelly. No, a 2-inch by 3-inch. So, like, sort of the size of between a softball and a baseball, maybe. And she used it on her lips at least once a day. And she said, I used the last of it in September 2017. I had this container of Vaseline for over 31 years.
I just think that's such stick-to-itiveness, holding on to that one jar.
All right. And so then second email just came in this morning, which Nina passed on to me. And it's from Justin. And Justin writes, Dear Gaffest, I was thoroughly entertained by the recent discussion of the seemingly endless nature of a container of Vaseline. As a moil, I do know of a situation where someone may use one or more complete containers of Vaseline after care the week following circumcision. No such thing as too much.
Well, to really understand his experience, you have to walk a mile in his shoes.
My very quick chatter is that I don't know if you guys saw this amazing story about how in September of 2025, the Pentagon spent $93.4 billion in September, including $50 billion on the last 5 days of September when they have. So the U.S. budgets are use it or lose it. So if you get to the end of the year and you haven't spent money, it just goes away. And so the Pentagon spent $50 billion in 5 days, which is $50 billion is more than the defense budgets of all but 4 nations on Earth. It is, more than the entire military budget of Mexico and Canada. And what they spent it on is will blow your mind. So they spent it on, there are lots on furniture. But for example, they spent $12,540 for fruit basket stands. They spent $2 million on Alaskan king crab in September. They spent, I think, $7 million on lobster tail. They had $26,000 for sushi preparation tables. There was a piano for the chief of staff of the Air Force, a $100,000 grand piano for the Air Force chief of staff's home, a $26,000 violin, a $22,000 custom handmade flute. Come on, guys. Come on. I mean, it's ridiculous that they feel like, oh, yeah, well, now we can spend.
And we also should remember, before we had the crises of tariffs, Epstein, the Iran war, we had the crisis of Doge, which was supposedly turning the entire government upside down to root out this kind of behavior.
Well, I saw some guy won a big bet on like Polymarket or something, where he bet that government spending would be higher this year than last year. And because, you're like, oh, Doge, they'll cut so much. And nope, of course it's higher.
Nope. Right.
Listeners, you've got chatters. Please keep them coming by emailing them to us at gabfest@slate.com. And our listener chatter this week comes from Mason Cash in Florida.
Hi, Gabfest. This is Mason in Oviedo, Florida. Ever since Emily suggested that the Major Questions Doctrine could have been a Gilbert and Sullivan parody song, I couldn't get the idea out of my head, so I had to work it out. Here goes, with apologies for my awful singing voice. I am the very model of the Major Questions Doctrine. I help explain the reasons for the very messed up spot we're in. I know the case is relevant from recent and from yesteryear, from Clean Air Act to student loans and rules that raise a fiscal fear. When stakes are high and presidents make moves authoritarian, I ask if Congress meant to grant a scope so libertarian. So when I see an agency grow suddenly imperial, I ask for textual evidence that this is what the Congress wills. I ought to be a neutral, sober and librarian, but I'm often employed as party tool, fickle and contrarian. The Supreme Court often uses me in ways quite arbitrarious. If it weren't for dire consequences, it would be hilarious. I should be applied consistently, impeccably nonpartisan, but somehow shut down Democrats and free up the Republican. But still, in matters regulatory, political and temporal, I am the very model of the Major Questions principle.
That was genius.
It's
Oh my
there's a
God.
whole, and it actually goes on and on. That was just one verse. It is so good. Like, we've got to find a way to print it. I don't know where we print. Do we have a place to print it? Can we put it on the GabFest
we'll figure
show page?
Something out.
It's so good.
Given our vast and extraordinary listenership, my guess is that we have some listener out there who has like been in Gilbert and Sullivan on Broadway, who should then
take
sing
it. Yeah,
the lyrics.
Yeah,
yes,
it's really good. I mean, he gets the meter so right. If you read it, I've read the whole thing, and it is so good. Slate has other podcasts this week, none with Gilbert and Sullivan content and Major Questions Doctrine content, but they have other things going for them. And the Slate Money podcast with Felix and Elizabeth and Emily talk about the hilarious episode where the McDonald's CEO was filmed eating a burger, the new Big Arch burger, and took a very small bite of the Big Arch and has been mocked. And Emily dares to eat a whole Big Arch. And they talk about the PR benefits and hits for eating and for CEOs enduring or enjoying their product on camera. That's all for our episode this week. We also have a bonus episode in your feed that is only for Slate Plus members. However, you will not get that unless you become a Slate Plus member, which I strongly advise you to become one by going to the Political Gabfest show page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or going to slate.com/Gabfest Plus. And we're going to talk about the kind of terrifying incident outside of Gracie Mansion, terrifying, potentially, a tragedy averted at Gracie Mansion when a person attempted to kill protesters and counter-protesters there. But again, you have to become a member to do that. Slate.com/Gabfest Plus. That's our show for today. The Gabfest is produced by Nina Porzucki. Our researcher is Emily Ditto. Our theme music is by They Might Be Giants. Ben Richmond is Senior Director for Podcast Operations. Mia Lobel is the EP of Slate Podcast. Hillary Fry and I hung out a ton last few days. Hello, Hillary. How you doing? She's the Editor-in-Chief of Slate. For Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson, I'm David Plotz. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.